A scathing new report from the U.S. Justice Department calls law enforcement's response to the 2022 school massacre in Uvalde, Texas, a failure, as survivors and loved ones of the 19 students and 2 teachers who were murdered seek accountability. More now from CNN's senior crime and justice correspondent, Shimon Prokupecz.
Tonight, the Justice Department releasing a damning new report about law enforcement's failures responding to the mass shooting in Uvalde, Texas.
The law enforcement response at Robb Elementary School on May 24, 2022, and in the hours and days after, was a failure that should not have happened.
I hope that the failures end today and the local officials do what wasn't done that day, do right by the victims and survivors of Robb Elementary.
We got shots fired at the school.
Bursts of gunfire.
The victims trapped in classroom 111 and 112 were waiting to be rescued at 11:44 a.m., approximately 10 minutes after officers first arrived, when the subject fired another shot inside the classrooms.
Reports a teacher was shot.
They were still waiting at 11:56 a.m. when an officer on the scene told law enforcement leaders that his wife, a teacher, was inside room 111 and 112 and had been shot.
A desperate 911 call from a trapped student.
The student was in a room full of victims. That student stayed on the phone with 911 for 16 minutes.
Major events that should have prompted police to step in immediately. Instead, police waited 77 minutes to stop the gunman.
49 minutes after officers arrived on the scene. And they were still waiting for another 27 minutes after that, until finally officers entered the classroom and killed the subject.
During those 77 minutes, 19 children and 2 teachers were killed. The long-awaited 575-page report is the fullest accounting of what happened, highlighting the serious failures in the law enforcement response.
These families didn't need a 400 or 500-page government report to learn that law enforcement failed them in a historic way.
While quick to arrive to the scene, their report found law enforcement stopped outside the classroom where the gunman was on a killing spree inside.
I think the report concludes that had the law enforcement agencies followed generally accepted practices in an active shooter situation and gone right after the shooter to stop him, lives would have been saved and people would have survived.
Countless other issues identified in the report after the gunman was killed, from the emergency medical response to how bereaved parents were told their children were dead.
Some families were told that their family members had survived when they had not.
Many family members of the victims and survivors thankful for the federal report detailing what went wrong that horrific day. But they are still frustrated by the lack of accountability.
We're grateful that we got what we have right now because it's probably the most updated information that any of us have gotten.
What else does she possibly need to prosecute or to remove these people from their positions of power when they can't even do their jobs?
The federal assessment does not make any recommendations for punitive steps for law enforcement. But in an exclusive interview with CNN, Attorney General Merrick Garland says the report provides a basis for accountability.
The community now has the kind of report necessary to make sure accountability occurs.
The Uvalde District Attorney says she's continuing to investigate, but families say they want charges brought against the officers.
We're going to continue fighting that some type of change is made in honor of our kids.
And Wolf, the Texas Governor Greg Abbott releasing a statement thanking the Department of Justice for their review. They said that they've already adopted some of the recommendations and they're continuing to work on improving school security here in Texas. Wolf?
Yeah, it's so heartbreaking, that story. Shimon, I want you to stand by. I want to continue this conversation with you. I also want to bring in Catherine Schweit. She's a former senior FBI official and an active shooter expert. Catherine, as I said, you're an expert on how police should have responded. The Attorney General, Merrick Garland, said they could have saved lives. What should we understand about the enormity of the failure here?
I think that is the best word about it. It is an enormity. It's astonishing to see, even though it's not surprising, the glaring disregard for best practices by the law enforcement who responded. And if you read the numbers and the details, you find out that law enforcement looked for more than a dozen. They gave more than a dozen excuses why they didn't go through that door when standard protocol that they trained in themselves 2 months before. They hosted a training 2 months before this shooting, law enforcement did, and they still found a dozen or more excuses, looking for keys or looking for ballistic shields. And then in the end, they went in anyway, and they didn't get injured, but they let those people die in there, and it's unforgivable.
And Catherine, this nearly 600-page report singled out the former school police chief, the former city police chief, and the current sheriff. What should accountability look like for them and perhaps for others?
Yeah, others here and also elsewhere. I think every police chief, mayor, and school district head should be sleeping with this book underneath their pillow and looking at the details of what's in it and what they didn't do, because it's a very, very number of people who are working now who let this happen. I don't think they should be at the helm anymore. They clearly didn't have any foresight to protect those children. And there are laws around that, I'm sure the DA is I'm a former prosecutor, considering whether or not the child protection laws for the state were violated. And that's probably part of what the challenge is right now.
Shimon, on that specific point, and you've been doing amazing reporting on this story ever since day one. Why hasn't the district attorney pursued any criminal charges yet? And will this report from the U.S. Justice Department change things?
I mean, it could change things because it gives the voice that the families here feel that they have not had. They have now the Attorney General of the United States here today, standing before them to the world, saying what happened here should not have happened, and this was a massive screw up. If you ask the families, Wolf, they'll tell you they believe that the DA is trying to protect herself politically. She's trying to protect some of the officers that were involved here because they can't understand why it's taking so long for her to make a decision. In her meetings with them, in private meetings, she has said that it's just taking a lot of time. She needs to gather more evidence. She needs to bring experts in. We have no indication. She's not spoken about any of this publicly. We have no indication if she's doing any of that. She keeps saying she's going to make a decision at some point. There's potentially going to be some grand jury that's going to hear some evidence, but it's really all a mystery because we just don't know. We have no insight, and she's really not given any information on what she's been doing. In fact, she's been preventing information from coming out. There's a lawsuit from media organizations requesting information, and she's fighting those. So it's not entirely clear what her end game here is going to be, but it's very, very frustrating for the families, Wolf.
Catherine, I want to play another little clip from our exclusive interview with the Attorney General, Merrick Garland. Listen to this.
Look, there's so much that we still need to do and that Congress needs to do. An 18-year-old should not have a military-grade weapon that belongs on a battlefield, not in a classroom.
So, Catherine, how does law enforcement actually make sure an enormous failure like this never ever happens again, especially when they're up against assault weapons?
What we saw here is that law enforcement had the right weapons to respond. The assault weapons are automatic weapons that we see being used in so many of these shootings. They're not the whole story, right? Handguns are part of the story too. But law enforcement has to be properly prepared. They have to have the equipment. So they have to have the equipment that they can beat, the same types of shooters.
Yeah, they got to do something to learn the lessons of this horrible disaster. Catherine Schweit, Shimon Prokupecz,